Welcome to Thursfields Talk Legal, a vidcast series from one of the leading law firms in the Midlands. I'm Steve Dyson, a journalist who's talking to a range of solicitors at Thursfields on legal topics of wide interest to the public or businesses. Today's episode is all about property auctions, and I'm going to talk to Darren Cox, an associate solicitor in the residential conveyancing department at Thursfields Solicitors. Hello to you, Darren.
Hello, Steve. Good to speak with you. Thanks for inviting me on.
No problems at all. Darren, I want to explore the interesting subject of property auctions with you and to focus on helping home buyers through this process. So let's start with the basic differences between buying a home traditionally, here in estate agents, and buying it at an auction.
So many people will have had experience of buying a home traditionally through an estate agent. And they'll probably recall that during that process, you instruct a solicitor, and your solicitor carries out searches on the property and raises inquiries with the seller's solicitors about lots of legal issues. And the reason that happens is because, just like when you're buying any product, the principle of buyer beware, or the Latin term caveat emptor, applies when you're buying a property. So it's all about the buyer carrying out their due diligence, really, in carrying out searches and asking inquiries of the sellers. Once the buyer's satisfied with the answers they've got and they're happy about the property that they're buying, they're then in a position to exchange contracts. And exchanging contracts has got quite a bit of legal significance, because once you exchange, that's when there is legal commitment between the seller and the buyer. So the seller is legally committed to go ahead and sell the property, buyer is legally committed to go ahead and buy. And you'll agree a completion date. So, for example, you could exchange contracts on a Monday with completion for a Friday. So you've actually got legal commitment between the Monday and the Friday that you know you're going to complete on the Friday and buy the property. Now, auctions differ. In normal times, at the time I'm speaking to you now, there are all sorts of restrictions around social gatherings because of coronavirus. But in normal times, auctions tend to take place in a room with an auctioneer, a room full of bidders. We've all seen these sorts of shows on TV, I'm sure, and people bid on a property known as a lot when the auctioneer runs through their lots. And once the auctioneer's gavel comes down on the winning bid, you've actually exchanged contracts at that point. So you've got legal commitment when the gavel comes down. You'll pay a 10% deposit on the day, and you will typically complete in 28 days after that. So not a great deal of time between exchange and completion.
Goodness, that is a big difference, isn't it? It's such a sudden process compared to traditional home searching and buying. So what's the most important thing to do if you're considering that auction route?
So the main thing to be aware of if you're considering buying at auction is being aware that when the gavel comes down, you exchange at that point and you have legal commitment, as I said earlier. The process of buyer beware applies here. So make sure as a buyer that you're doing your due diligence before the auction. Auctioneers tend to publish auction packs probably 3 or 4 weeks before the auction typically, and the auction pack will contain legal papers about the property and searches which are relevant to the property. Make sure you get hold of that pack in good time and review it to make sure you're comfortable with the legal aspects of the property. But it's not just about reviewing the pack, it's about knowing what you're looking for. And obviously as solicitors, we're trained on these things to know what the legal papers mean on a property. So it's a good idea to instruct a solicitor as early as possible, really, to review the pack for you and give you some advice about the legal content of the pack. While doing that, it's a good idea to instruct the solicitor in good time. It's not really any good going to a solicitor, for example, the afternoon before an auction, because they probably won't have sufficient time to go through the pack properly and give you the advice that you need, so you know all about what you're bidding for. Also, make sure you've got your funding in place. As I said, when the gavel goes down, you exchange at that point, and you've got 28 days then to complete, which isn't a great deal of time to raise your funding. So make sure you've either got funding or you're reasonably confident that you can obtain that funding during the 28-day period. Auctions are really all about doing your homework and being prepared.
That makes sense, and the reminder to do your homework is obviously important. But there is still a scary time in that auction room, isn't there? When a slight raising of the eyebrow or moving your arm could mean you've unknowingly bought an expensive home.
Yeah, well, we've all seen TV shows about that, I'm sure. But to be honest, there are lots of myths about auctions. Auctioneers tend to be fairly experienced. They know when someone's placing a serious bid or not. And nowadays, anyway, there's a requirement for bidders to pre-register with the auctioneer, and you'll typically get a bidding number or a paddle with the bidding number on for you to hold up when you're bidding. So I think really the chances of attending to an itchy nose and finding that you've accidentally bought a 3-bed semi in Stourbridge, they're pretty slim, really.
And are all auctions traditional with an auctioneer and bidders in a room, as you described, or are there different types?
There are different types of auctions. So far, we've focused on traditional auctions, but there's also something known as the modern method of auction. And with the modern method of auction, there's an auction company, often an estate agent actually, with a bolt-on business to the traditional estate agency, and they place properties on a website which, to all intents and purposes, is quite similar to an eBay-style website that people will probably be familiar with. And the property will be on that website for, say, 30, 35 days typically. People who are interested in buying the property will place bids on the property, and at the end of the 35-day period, there'll usually be a winning bid. But the crucial difference between the modern method of auction and the traditional method is at the end of that 35-day period, if you've placed a winning bid, you don't exchange contracts at that point. Instead, as the buyer, you pay a reservation fee to the auction company. Now, the reservation fee can be quite expensive, often thousands of pounds. It's usually a percentage of the winning bid. And the reservation fee doesn't actually form part of the purchase price, unlike the deposit that you pay in a traditional auction. The reservation fee is paid to the auctioneer or the estate agent, and it's effectively a commission that you're paying as the buyer. And in return for paying that reservation fee, you'll get an exclusivity period, usually 56 days, and you've got that 56-day window then in which to exchange and complete. As long as you do that, fine, the property's yours. You pay the purchase money, 10% on exchange later on, and the rest on completion, in addition to the reservation fee that you've already paid. You pay that money and the property's yours. But if for some reason you can't get your funding together or something happens and you can't complete within that exclusivity period of 56 days, you do risk losing the property, losing your reservation fee, and the seller simply puts the property back on the market. It's still a good idea to get an auction pack with a modern method of auction. It is still an auction, so there are packs available. They're often online and you can download them, have a look at them, again, get legal advice like I said earlier. But the big difference to remember with a modern method of auction is there is no exchange at the point of the winning bid and paying the reservation fee, unlike with a traditional auction.
And going back to the traditional auctions, Darren, have they effectively stopped because of COVID-19?
Well, yes and no, really. Traditional auction houses are still operating, but clearly in the world we live in at the moment, with all sorts of restrictions on social gatherings and social distancing and so on, you can't practically have a room full of bidders and an auctioneer in the traditional sense of auctions. So lots of traditional auction houses have quite recently moved to an online real-time streaming method. So the auctioneer will be in a room with a video camera, they're filmed, bidders register, log on from home or wherever they are, and they can place bids virtually, either by phone, on the internet, or by pre-arranged proxy with the auctioneer. Gavel comes down on the screen and you still have the legal commitment at that point, but you're just not in a room together. But it's a really good point to be aware of, because I have focused on the difference between a traditional auction and a modern method of auction. And up until March this year, modern method of auctions would always be online. Traditional auctions would tend to be in a room. But nowadays, traditional auctions are being live streamed as well. But just because they're online doesn't make them a modern method of auction.
Well, you've made the auction routes really clear, and I think that's very useful to people, Darren. They both seem easier, indeed, than the old way of buying houses, which involved searching, visiting, negotiating, then suffering things like gazumping and other hurdles. But why do buyers still need the expense of a solicitor if they use the auction route?
Well, although the auction can simplify the process and reduce the time, you have to remember that you're still buying a house. It's still a substantial financial commitment for many of us, the most money that we will spend during our lifetimes. And you still need conveyancing done, which is the transferring of the legal title from the seller to the buyer. So you'll need a solicitor to attend to those formal aspects, preparing a transfer deed, dealing with land registry requirements and so on, to get the property registered in your name. But as I said, with the auction pack, it's also about making sure you know what documents you're looking for. So the legal documents and searches that are in there, if you don't know what you're looking for, you can very easily get your fingers burnt. So it's really important to get appropriate legal advice before you bid. I've seen examples of people who have unfortunately had their fingers burnt by not getting appropriate advice on an auction pack, and they've ended up buying a property, for example, that has a short lease on it, which they didn't know about, or issues with the legal title of the property. I remember one where there was a strip of land between the public highway and the property without sufficient rights to pass over that strip of land. So in theory, you couldn't access your property from the highway. These are all things that a solicitor can give you advice on early on in the process. Also to be very mindful of things like coal mining, particularly in the Black Country area. I've seen people buy properties where the property is affected by historic disused mine shafts which haven't been properly treated. And if you don't know about that, that can come as quite a shock to you once you've committed to buy the property. And that can make the property unmortgageable, really, if you need mortgage finance. So you do still need a solicitor to make sure your interests are catered for and that you don't get your fingers burnt at auction.
Darren, it's been fascinating exploring the topic of property auctions in so much detail with you. For those watching, can you give a quick takeaway summary of the most important things to remember?
Yeah, there are quite a few points, really. So if you're going to go to an auction, I would say it's a good idea to go to one beforehand without intending to bid, so you can just get a feel for the place and see how the processes work, become familiar with what happens on an auction on the day. Make sure you get hold of the auction pack early on if you're planning to bid on a property, and give that pack to a solicitor fairly early on so you can get the best advice about the legal aspects of the property. As with buying any property, make sure you do your homework, perhaps go and visit the property at different times of the day and night, during the week, at weekends, so you can see if there are differences on different days about how busy the traffic is outside, what the parking situation is like outside the property and so on. Make sure you've got your funding in place, particularly if you're buying a traditional auction. As I said, when the gavel goes down, you've then got 28 days to complete, which isn't a great deal of time. So make sure you've got funding in place to complete, or you're reasonably confident that you can easily access the funding during that period of time. Know whether you're going to a modern method of auction or whether it's a traditional auction. Sounds silly, but I have had people come to me who've purchased at a modern method of auction and haven't really appreciated the differences between the two because they haven't got the legal advice early on. So make sure you're clear on whether you're buying through a traditional auction route or a modern method of auction. And I would say plan your budget. If you're looking at buying a property, you can get in the auction room and the adrenaline can kick in and you can easily get carried away. But make sure that on these occasions, your head overrules your heart so you don't be beyond your budget.
Good advice. And finally, Darren, whichever route people use, if they need advice on buying properties, how can they get in touch with an expert at Thursfields?
Well, in the first instance, you could contact me on 01902 904 262, or you could drop me an email at dcox@thursfields.co.uk. Our website also has a wealth of information about general conveyancing, and that's thursfields.co.uk.
Darren Cox, an Associate Solicitor in the Residential Conveyancing Department at Thursfields Solicitors. Many thanks for joining us on Thursfields Talk Legal.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back soon to talk to more legal experts here at Thursfields about other interesting aspects of the legal world. Thursfields Talk Legal. Thanks for listening.